Okay. Good morning to you all. Please come in, have a seat. Closing doors in 1 minute. Welcome to track 2. We are here on smarter production to scale up on audience reach. My name is Giedrius and I'm the room host for today. And the only thing I want to tell you is a kind of dynamic ad insertion I just heard from Sam. This Radio Days is coming to you by a lot of sponsors, gold, silver and bronze. To mention Triton Digital, Explorer Media, Cyber. We're all very happy that they're sponsoring Radio Days. I give the mic to Sam to take over the meeting. Enjoy all.
Thank you, Liedewij. Guten Morgen. How's everyone doing? Oh my goodness gracious me. Wow. Did everyone have a good night last night? Yeah. Can we get a feel of people in the room? Who is public service? Okay, mostly. That is helpful because, by the way, we've got 5 speakers and 4 of them are public service. So that's good. We're going to have lots of public service stuff today. Not all. Who's commercial? A few. And any independent? No, 1. Very good. Okay, cool. So today we're going to have loads of questions. I want as much kind of engagement from you guys as possible. If you have a thought or a question, or if you vehemently disagree with anything that's said on stage, just put your hand up and we will come to you as quickly as we can. Today we're going to be talking about technology and how we combine traditional technologies with new stuff and how we grow our audiences in areas which we're all very excited about, on podcasts and digital and online and social, whilst also maintaining our linear audiences. And crucially, today is about doing that stuff without spending too much money. That is what we're going to be talking about today. And we've got 5 great speakers who've got 5 great examples of things that they're doing. And I think we should start off by just people introducing themselves. Andrew, do you want to kick us off? Tell us who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Sam. So hi, everyone. My name's Andrew Davies. I'm from the Australian ABC, which is the Australian public broadcaster. And my role, I'm the manager of digital and audio content development. So I'm very involved with podcast commissioning, with content strategy, with distribution, whole range of things across the organisation.
Great. And we're going to hear you about your case study in a moment. Camille, introduce yourself. Who are you and where are you from?
I'm Camille Bondeville. I'm co-founder of Sound and Pepper, and we're audiophile collaborative tools.
Fritz.
I'm Fritz, Bayerischer Rundfunk, ARD, Public Service Media, and I'm the digital lead of the 2 major brands, Bayern 1 and Bayern 3.
Yeah, Giedrius Masalskis, LRT, Lithuanian Radio. I'm a head of radio. We have 3 channels, the main one, informational, classical, and alternative music. So I run the department.
My name's Alison Broddle, and I'm the Senior Director of Audio and Podcasting for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is public radio in Canada.
Great. Okay, so 5 really interesting people from interesting organizations. We are now going to go round and everyone is going to tell us what your case study is. How are you combining new tech with old tech without spending too much money?
And
Andrew.
Sam is looking at me.
And you've got 3 minutes.
I guess that's my cue. Hi, everyone. I'm not used to being in the round, but it's really great. So my example is not about technology per se, but more about culture and internal cultural change. So the ABC, like many of you, we're an established public broadcaster, and we're really trying to encourage our radio teams to think more about on-demand, particularly podcasting. So it's very much a work in progress. So about 18 months ago, I led a project to try and essentially shift some of more of our radio teams from our Radio National Network, which is our BBC Radio 4 equivalent, so it's our specialist speech and talks network, to try and shift people thinking more towards digital first and podcasting. So essentially what I did was I worked with teams. There are about 40 different shows on the network, and essentially we did 1-hour sessions with every team to sort of give them an overview of the landscape when it came to podcasting, answer questions about the podcast space, answer questions about their show and where their show fitted into the podcast landscape, and questions about craft, introduction, style, tone, scripting, all those kinds of things, and where their shows fitted in the landscape. And also gave them a sense of kind of what was happening internationally, because I think a lot of content teams, maybe in your organisations, if they're the same, people are very focused on their shows, which is great, it's what we want, but they're not as focused at kind of taking their heads out of that and seeing what else is going on. And I think there's that challenge sometimes within radio teams. So that was part of the focus, was really encouraging those teams to think about podcast data as well. So I did, as part of those sessions, it was very much showing them, data around their shows, most popular episodes, things they could learn from that they could apply to their radio shows to make them a better fit for the podcast space. And the challenge for our radio teams very much is that they can't make two versions of their shows. We're riding two horses, so we're trying to do linear at the same time as trying to do podcasting. So the aim was very much to try and make a better version of their radio shows the first time, to make them a better fit for the podcast space, essentially. And the second part of this process was focusing on an audio style guide, which is, I know, not super exciting, and it wasn't well received the first time we talked about this. But the idea was to try and have like a single document that teams could focus on who are new to the network, to really think about audio craft, style, tone, a lot of the things that came through the individual workshops with teams, to have like a sort of a North Star document, if you like, that really was best practice when it came to podcasting. And that was the next stage of the process. So that was about 6 months of consultation with teams, getting feedback about the things we were recommending. And that included things like making sure that their introduction was self-contained, so that people coming to the podcast in the podcast space essentially could understand what the show was and didn't need to have heard the previous segment on the radio. Things like that. And also taking out resets from their podcast versions of their shows. So the point of this was not to turn their shows into Radiolab and those highly produced podcasts, but was to try and achieve greater longevity with the content in the podcast space and make them a better fit for the podcast space. And that was an interesting process, because cultural change, is hard, as I'm sure many of you know in your organisations. And I think there are different approaches to that. There's a sort of disruptive approach to change, where you kind of create a new team to try and change things, or there's the more iterative process, which was very much what this project was about. And I think one of the big learnings, I think for us, was trying to get people, you can work with people who want to be worked with, rather than trying to drag people to the process. And I think I think in many ways, by having people who are open to change and bringing them on board and then showing them the results, that really helped with this process. And one of the most popular presenters on the network was, I think it's probably fair to say, quite sceptical about this process, but she really saw the value of this. And then she actually talked about that in a whole of staff meeting, which went a long way to bringing on board other people as part of this process. So I guess that's a long way of saying this project is still ongoing. In a lot of cases, we've brought the average of shows up in the podcast space, but it's still very much a work in progress. And it's that challenge of continual change, which is hard. And Sam and I were talking about this last night in another context, but it's very much just trying to build that into teams' workflows and to encourage them to try new things, really, in many ways. So that's kind of what we've been doing.
Really interesting. Looking forward to hearing about those hour-long sessions. Camille, tell us what your idea is.
So definitely agree with trying new things. So I have a bit more of a tech angle. Generally at Sound & Pepper, we're working off two assumptions. The first one is that, it's not my words, media companies are also tech companies. It's Sila Benko who said that yesterday. And the second one is that diversity is key. And us as good tech companies, we need to make sure that we put a lot of effort into UX and accessibility in order to lower the barriers to entry for new talent. And now I'm feeling the mezcal from yesterday. Sorry about this. And generally, that's where Sound & Pepper comes in. We are focused on lowering barriers to entry for new talents, and we want to enable them to bring their own tools. And this includes Google Docs, or Google Suite, sorry. Everybody familiar with Google Docs? Yeah, hopefully. Thanks. And generally, our idea is that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We're using existing technology, integrating it into Google Docs, and allowing people to get their audio content ready for post-production afterwards. And all the editing is done as you use your Google Docs, basically. Very simple, hopefully. And so the goal is to allow a more diverse set of users to enter the audio space, and also enable more co-productions, so removing silos between companies, between entities, and hence reaching, hopefully, more audiences.
Great, really interesting use of technology there. Fritz, tell us a little bit about what your idea is.
Yes, I'm going to tell a little bit about our project. So please, can you give me the presentation?
Yeah, we have a couple of slides here.
Okay, thank you. And as this session is a part of the strategy track of the Radio Days, I'm going to talk about use cases that are interesting, particularly from the management perspective. So particularly when it comes to smart solutions for producing content of a variety of platforms while maintaining the stability of resources. But let me first provide you some context about the brands I'm in charge of. So we have Bayern 1 with 3.3 million daily listeners, target audience 45 to 55. It's an 80s-based AC. We have a regional focus and an emphasis on constructive journalism. And we run the brand as a 360 brand, so with digital touchpoints on air, off air, and online. And the same goes for Bayern 3. It's the younger brand, target audience 25-35. It's a format between HDC and CHR. It's entertainment and regional-driven stories with 2.2 million listeners daily and a potential, and that's very interesting, of over 10 million people at least listening once a month. So what I brought are two different types of case studies. The first is, which we can call the input case, is about harvesting existing content. And the second one is a kind of output case, how we put up an integrated value chain for our brands. I begin with an integrated value chain. What does that mean for our brands? Is that we enrich, we enhance, we reassemble already existing content. And how we are operating this, here are 3 examples. Number 1, we developed content management system, particularly for conversational audio. It was an EBU project supported by the EBU Immo Fund. And this allows us the segmentation and the tailored editing of conversational audio on multiple smart devices, and this can be applied to topics, pieces of radio. We use this for in-depth news specials and so on. Number 2 is we're establishing workflows for automated content production, which is very important for us. We do it together with our external partners like David Systems, for instance. And this allows us to have AI-driven approaches, for instance, to convert a radio show into a podcast on its own, or to do individualization, customize things, or hyperlocalize our content. And number 3 is it's to keep the younger audiences on our platforms. We use our stereo signal and we scale it up to a 3D binaural audio signal. And this gives us the possibility to reach out to young listeners with their true wireless headphones and the sound experience, the music experience they are already familiar with. So reversely, other direction is harvesting content, because we detected that we have about 600,000 meaningful interactions in our communities containing comments, direct messages, and the force. And this is the reason why we began to actively fostering and growing our digital brand community. So we formed an extra team of editors with these specialized skills. For certain shows, we replaced the radio editor with the community editor. We created formats that include the community content or are completely based on the community content. And for our brand, this provides really unique and exclusive content. And it saves money because we do not have to license and to buy content from third-party platforms or agencies. In this way, we are very, very close to our audience. This gives us valuable insights about needs, emotions, what they're struggling with. And due to the regular framework, we are the public service broadcaster, unfortunately not allowed to market and to monetize this content. But if we were permitted to do so, this would be also a valuable source for marketing strategy, for sales department, and so on. So before I conclude, let me add some key takeaways. So this integrated value chain, this provides us a digital reach increase of about 15 to 20% across all platforms. And the engagement with our audiences has already paid off. And when it comes to the technical perspective, for us it matters really to keep things smart and simple and easy for our audience. And this is the reason why we often consider platform agnostic services instead of using really proprietary solutions.
Very cool, very interesting. Giedrius, tell us a little
Yes,
bit about
sorry guys for your necks. I'll have my presentation as well, but it's just a couple of slides. So I came from a faraway country. In airport, it's written, nobody knew where Vilnius is. Thankfully, pilot did. So yeah, it's Lithuania. It's a Baltic state. We are on the border with Russia, with Belarus, and it's tricky. So we have lots of news about Ukraine. That's why you see the flower in my on my chest, and we are very big supporters for Ukraine, and we have a lot of news. So bad news, actually. There are no good news with war. So we noticed some decline of audience. So we have to use some tools to reach them somewhere else, because some escape to other radios, like music radios or some pop radios. Others escape to some, I don't know, other platforms, YouTube and so on. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We have a visual radio. That's what I'm going to talk about. And this is a sort of a tool that we are using to squeeze the lemon out of it. First of all, yes, I have to declare that audio is the first. It's default for us. So we are not going to be a television. We're not trying to, but yeah, we have a fully automatic camera system in our studios, in all our studios. We broadcast 24/7. We are obliged by the law broadcast news every hour. So that's what we have to show to our listeners and viewers. So first of all, was it easy to implement visual radio? No, it wasn't easy. There were people who were afraid of how do they look. Some of them even were thinking to put a wig on, and they were worried about the clothing and stuff like that. So that was also cultural stuff, like you said. It's very, very tough, especially when we have a public media service where we cannot change team as easy as it's possible in commercial radios. So we use short snippets. I'll run through some practical stuff. We use some short snippets, video snippets on social networks. It's definitely not a secret that it's much attractive than some audio track or still image. We use it to attract our people to our audio platform, and then to listen to the full episode. We can use our video, as you can see below, as a communication tool. That's a crowdfunding campaign, Radarum. We launched it second year in a row. It's collecting money to support Ukraine, and we use it as a communication tool. We also provide video for guests. Some snippets also sending them to share on their reels, on their stories. It's also very useful and attractive. Visual streams helps us to go into YouTube. Actually, we have a philosophical question whether we have to promote our product on YouTube, because our mission, vision, and so on relies on our own platforms to attract to our platforms. But anyway, the YouTube users, they are not visiting our platforms. That's why we going there. I wouldn't say classical, for instance, radio is very successful with that, but news is quite good, and people are using it. Also, we stream our video streams on television. We have a television channel which has no program at night, but every hour they took our signal and they are showing our news. And we agreed to cable TVs, and now people can find our programs as a regular TV program. So among them, so that's I think sort of trying to catch people over there. And there are some couple of things like voting results. It's engaging audience. So we can use it as a tool for listening to our audience. What do they think? Which answer is good for them? We can use live reporter stream. We can show them whether it's spot on some border between Lithuania or Belarus or some stuff like that. And just a tiny thing that's titles. It's also automatic, so you can watch this video and you can see who's sitting in a studio, which is a bit better because we are trying to go to your topic. Make architecture of our audio on FM as close as it's possible to podcast, like for digital content. So that's it. We noticed that people are really watching our channels. A couple of times we had a problem with our streams. There was no signal at all, so we got complaints. So yeah, so it's yeah. We cannot see how you waving your hands and shouting on each other without microphone and stuff. So
Great, really interesting. Alison.
Thank you. I have to say, one of the things I love about coming to this conference is the shared misery of the challenges of behind the scenes. We're all trying to do very similar things, and I think no matter how brilliant the AI future is, a lot of it comes down to convincing our staff and convincing other people to do things. So I'm heartened to hear that other people have those same problems. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I have a similar challenge to Andrew in that we make 100 radio programs every week at the CBC. A lot of them are live local morning shows. But we also do packaged network shows and live network shows. For those of you who haven't been to Canada or looked at our time zones, we have 6 time zones. That's why we have so many local regional morning shows. And we needed to figure out which of those radio programs made sense to really put a lot of effort into what we call podcast pivots. Which is a nicer way of saying repurposing the audio content to find a new audience. And so I've got 5 quick takeaways from what we've learned from doing these podcast pivots. The first one is, and it sounds so basic, you have to think about the audience first. So it doesn't matter what your favorite program is on your network, and it doesn't matter who's got the loudest voice or which host is grumpier. You have to think about, what does the podcast audience want? And so for us, that meant we chose a very small number of programs to do our podcast pivots with. We didn't just say across the board, everybody gets the same love. Although I love all my children, my programs equally, some of them make more sense to put a bit more effort into as a podcast pivot. The second thing, and we've heard a little bit about the team and the culture and getting the team on board. That's the second takeaway. If you don't have that, you're not going to be successful. The third thing we learned is that for each one of these pivots, we've customized it. So for some of them, we needed to get the host of the program to really change up their tone and their approach. Some of our hosts, it will shock you, have a very old school radio kind of sound to them. And we've done performance work with some of those hosts so that they sound more conversational, they sound more appealing to a younger audience, which is what the audience that's consuming the podcasts. Some of our radio programs are an hour long, and so we've cut them into 2 half hours and dropped them as 2 separate podcasts over the course of the week instead of dropping the 1 hour. Because we did testing and we realized the audience has a limited amount of time to listen to podcasts, and they preferred to have it in those 2 chunks rather than having 1 hour. We just had better success with that. Sometimes all we did was tweak the description of the program as a podcast. And we saw overnight an improvement in how many people were downloading and listening to that podcast. So as I say, it's been different for every one of the pivots that we've done. We're still learning as we go. The fourth takeaway is that once you've got a team to do that pivot, whether it's changing up the host's tone, whether it's changing the length and when they drop the podcast, you have to promote it. You have to cross-promote it. You have to, if you're lucky enough to have a paid campaign or a paid social campaign, you should do that. My promise to my teams was that if you build it, I will give you the rocket fuel to make it successful. But you have to do the work first. You have to show me that you've done that pivot, and then we will do the promotion, and we will make a big deal out of your podcast. The last thing, the fifth takeaway, is subscribing to this idea of build, measure, and learn. So we've had a couple of failures, which I'm happy to share here. Well, I wouldn't say failures, learnings, because we have moved on from them. So our daily network, morning network show, The Current, it's 90 minutes long. And it usually divides up quite cleanly into 3 topics, 3 parts, each a half hour in the mornings. And we thought that people don't have much time in the mornings to listen to a podcast, so we're going to choose one part and we're going to drop that as the podcast. Turns out that was a huge mistake. What people actually want is better descriptions of all 3 parts, and they want the ability to look, even if they're only going to listen to one, because they've only got half an hour in the morning. They didn't want us to choose for them. They wanted, depending on the day of the week and their mood and what else they were consuming, they wanted to be able to pick the really heavy news, the lighter piece, the panel discussion, the politics. And so that was a huge learning for us. And we went back to the drawing board and changed up how we were doing things. So I guess that's my final takeaway, is being flexible even after you've done the pivot. Be flexible, look back at what the audience seems to be responding to, and change it up again.
Great. Really interesting. Thank you so much to everyone for talking us through their case studies. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask to kick us off? Just to remind people, we had cultural change within an organization, repurposing content for different platforms, visualizing radio and podcasts as well. The podcast pivot, which I think is a great phrase, which I love.
Better than me.
And then Camille with using Google Docs as a kind of technology in order to kind of help the collaborative, creative process. Do you want to introduce yourself, to where you're from, and then ask your question?
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm from the BBC World Service. I'm the editor of the Global News podcast. I was just interested in your last point when you said you'd made a mistake and that they wanted to choose themselves. How do you know that? Was that, obviously you can tell from downloads, but how do you know that was the reason?
So we did surveys. We have an internal focus group, but we also have a tiny bit of money to do external focus groups as well in that target demographic, right? In that 30 to 49-year-old who are not our typical listeners at public radio, as you know. So we were able to ask them if this, if that, and what would you prefer? And when we gave them back the choice, we could see the difference. Yep.
And I think we have a question over here. Introduce
Hello.
yourself, say where you're from.
Hi, I'm Ismail, came from Berlin, work for David System, and I was wondering for Bayerischer Rundfunk, kind of similar to the question that just came, but the assumption of the binaural being something that new people or younger people are attracted to, where did that come from, and how is it going? Is that already available to people or just a test?
Thank you for the question. It is available. You can check it on our website. And a reason why we are doing this and why we decided to go this path is that we have so much younger audiences in the Gen Z, for instance, who are familiar with using the true wireless headphones. They are familiar with that from Apple Music, from the 3D audio formats. And that's the reason why we decided to provide this type of content also for our station Bayern 3. And how we do it is we took the stereo signal, then we have an halo upmix to Dolby 7.1.2, and then we downsize it and downmix it again with the Dolby system, and then we deliver it on our HLS encoder. So it can be used, of course, when you listen over IP, not via DAB Plus or FM, of course.
Great, really interesting. Question over here.
Hi, my name is Nima Shams. I work for the Swedish Radio in learning and development. And I have a 2-part question. You all kind of emphasize the importance of the team. And I'd like to know more about what you regard as a successful team. And also, when you make learnings, when you learn something, how do you make sure that is spread across the organization?
And I think this is probably a question for everyone, actually.
Yeah, good questions. In terms of the first part about what I consider a successful team, I think a team that is open to learning and to its continual change. I don't think it's different for every team. I think in Swedish Radio, I know we talk a lot about cross-functional teams, which I think is a really fantastic thing. And I think that general skill development and people being open to doing new things, I think for me, I'll take that as a win in terms of kind of what I consider a successful team. And the second part of the question was about how you achieve broader reach with that. Is that right? Forgive me.
How do you share that learning across the organization?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think in the example I gave with Radio National, which is the ABC Specialist Speech and Talk Network, it was trying to do, the idea of doing these workshops with teams was to try and do it across the network. I can't do it across the whole of radio because obviously it varies from different team. But the idea of doing the individual workshops was to kind of relate to teams on their level in a good way. I don't mean that in a patronising way. I mean in a practical way that's relevant for them, and then to share that across the across the department when it comes to the style guide. So that was the attempt to do that, and also having workshops and having discussions about the style guide. So it wasn't a dry process because style guides, don't set passions racing, I think it's fair to say. So it was very much about kind of having some discussions that came out of the style guide. So trying to sort of encourage people to sort of raise issues that were relevant, that kind of applied to them, and kind of sharing the knowledge themselves rather than the sort of top-down approach, more the sort of bottom-up organic approach, if that makes sense.
What were those conversations like? Like if you're talking to a team about kind of transformation and change, like what kind, what are people raising?
Well, the first thing was I didn't approach it that way. I didn't use the word transformational change deliberately.
That's
which was
wise.
A learning. There was a great book I read a couple of years ago. I don't know if people are familiar with the book called Who Moved the Cheese? Do people know that book? No? Okay. It's a great book. Someone gave it to me a couple of years ago, and it's one of the best books I've read about change. It doesn't apply to media, it applies in general, in life. And I highly recommend it. But in terms of the process, I think because I've worked across our podcast team, I've worked across our radio teams, I've come from that background. So I think having a trusted person, hopefully I fit that category, of someone who's been in the trenches, if that makes sense, who's come through the ranks, who understands the workflows, understands the teams, may not have worked at every show, but understands exactly how things work. So I think me having those conversations, I wasn't the direct line manager of those teams. I was coming in from the side, if that makes sense, and very much focused on having conversations with teams about questions. And I think so often in organisations we talk about change, we talk about it at a sort of mass level, but I think being able to relate to those teams at their level, and again, not in a patronising way, but in a way that is relevant to their week and their show, was important. And I think having questions, really having a conversation, was a way of achieving some change, as opposed to me coming in and saying, okay, we want to change tomorrow, and trying to sort of encourage people to ask those questions. And it sounds a bit cliched, but to sort of start a journey, if that makes sense. So begin a process as opposed to, okay, we want to change tomorrow.
I'll just add to that. And Andrew, you had a great example of this yesterday with your Quick Smart team on your podcast. And I would say having someone on the team who's in the target demographic is really helpful, because at my organization, we've aged along with our audience. And so, we have to work hard to bring in young people and strategically put at least one of them on each of those teams, because they're the ones consuming the content. They're the ones saying, well, you know what? Me and my friends, this is how we're listening to content. I think that's helpful. And then the second thing I would say, just at the hiring level, that, on your big long list of criteria when you're hiring someone, adaptability moves to the very, very top of the list. And yes, you want them to have the journalism, and yes, you want them to have the technical skills. But I think primarily having someone who is open to that change and understands that their job is going to change every 6 to 12 months that's key. That's something I think is key.
And Camille, sorry, Fritz. I was just going to bring Camille in quickly just for 1 second, if that's all right, Fritz, and then jump in. But like technical skills, like you're talking about kind of, like technical skills is a thing, right? We're kind of all training our teams, and teams are getting up to speed with things, but sometimes that's a bit tricky.
That would be exactly my point, because what matters is to have an interdisciplinary team, so to tackle problems from a technical perspective, from the editor's perspective. And what we are doing, we put up the projects in a kind of sandbox scenario, off-grid. Let people find good solutions, let's tackle the challenge, and then we try to scale it up in our organization. So.
Yeah, so not to... I don't want to be too rude, but basically, like cross-functional, diverse teams is kind of the base that you need to build on, and you need to make sure your teams are agile and that they're not static. So, like, yes, it's great to bring new talents into your teams, but like, make sure they move around as well, so that you make sure you learn from them, make sure they have a voice, and like they are able to suggest new ways of working, new tools, new workflows, because ultimately they're the one who know best.
We have a question here.
And also, how do you promote all this thing out of your organization, out of your radio, out of your P1 or P2s? So do you go into the different platforms? So you go into Spotify podcast to Apple podcast, or you going with the Google ads or some? Because all we do, why we do all this thing, we want to reach new listener, how to approach them, how to find them out of the just cross promotion in the radio.
So I think this is my kind of question for you, Giedrius, and it's something that we're thinking about at the BBC as well. It's like, if you're basically putting a radio show on the telly, what's your promotional strategy around that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the strategy that is written and we cannot change it. We adopt. We see whether it's working or not. We put some money into ads and social network if it's really worth it. Definitely we use our platforms. If we have a very good podcast, we use the television, we use a website with the clicks and stuff. Yeah, it's a sort of, we haven't decided whether we have to promote our content on Spotify or we have to say no, it's just a Radioteca in Lithuania. So we haven't decided yet. But on the air, we don't say that you can listen to it on Spotify, because Spotify doesn't give us numbers, so we don't promote them. So that's it.
And as I mentioned earlier, we at the Bayerischer Rundfunk, we use this three-pillar strategy. So we have on-air, off-air, and the digital services. And we run a dual strategy. For us, it's very, very important to be in place on Spotify, on YouTube, to get this audio reach, particularly when it comes to younger audiences. And we see not our radio program, but for us, it's our radio brand. So we have this brand experience with the touch points on all platforms, and this is how we make sure that there's enough reach and that we can reach out to the right audiences.
Because to come back to my kind of initial thing that I said at the beginning, right? This is about basically doing more but not spending more. So you're making quite strategic decisions about which platform you are putting promotional money behind.
We don't mention Spotify and Apple by name. We do that, fudge generic wherever you get your podcasts line, knowing full well that most people get their podcasts there and not on our platform. But I think the other thing to remember, and we do promote our podcasts on the radio, but when you're going after a new audience, you kind of are starting from the point that they're not actually listening to you already, right? They're listening to other things on other platforms, and our job is to take our great content and put it there where they already are, and not assume, because our audience is 50, 60 plus, right? Most public radio audiences are at the upper end. And so we tend to use our original podcasts to promote our radio program podcasts, because, is James Cridlin here? I'm sure he will say the way most people find out about podcasts is from other podcasts, right? It's through that cross-promotion, get a pre-roll, get a mid-roll, get the host to mention. And so that's much more effective in driving audiences to those radio program pivot podcasts than talking about them endlessly on the radio, because that audience is quite likely not going to then... They're already listening to you. They're not going to go find the podcast.
And just one of the things I'd say is about data when it comes to promotion, and also one of the things I found with radio teams particularly who are making podcast or radio versions of their podcasts. you know, in radio you get a lot of, I can see my colleague Steve Ahern in the room and other people who know way more about radio data than me, but in terms of, one of the things I've noticed is that, you know, radio teams get, sort of in Australia, get the broad survey information about their shows and the share and the reach, but one of the things with the process I've talked about is radio teams loved seeing the data about their shows, the podcast versions of their shows, because you can get much more granular with the podcast data. You can see what were the most popular episodes. You can see trends from that can help inform their radio shows. So that was a big part of the process, being able to actually get more granular about, okay, well, this episode performed well, so did this one. Why was that, do you think? You know, those kinds of questions that can really help inform, arguably make a better radio version of their shows. And that's really interesting.
This has been a really interesting and brilliant conversation, so thanks to all of you. A lot of the ideas, concepts, and actually the people kind of driving today's session have been David Systems, and specifically Albert from David Systems. Do you want to just kind of round off this morning, Albert? What have you taken away from all of these conversations, do you think, around how broadcasters and around how podcasters can kind of continue to use new technology whilst driving their linear audiences, while spending not too much money?
How much time do I have?
Yeah, about a minute.
No, this talk, I talked to every one of you before the conversation, and it again turned out totally different than I imagined, and I learned a lot of new things. But maybe what I wanna see is what I noticed in this conversation is a thing. There is a lot of value in the things that we do well, like example linear radio, and I think we have undervalued it a little bit in the last years because we are trying to, as we said, we're trying to reach the audience everywhere. So having a good base, I think, is key to that change, but also infusing change into the teams, having new ideas, having somebody who is new to the team, who cares a lot about social media, who infects the rest of the team, who are very experts in broadcasting, and doing this in a non-confrontative way, more in a self-marketing kind of way. That's kind of the key. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we need to continuously infuse new ideas into this process. Also, not being afraid that some things don't work out, and take the learnings from it. So having this kind of mindset to, it's great that we did this because we learned a massive amount of things. So doing this and continuing this, I think, makes me hopeful for the future.
Well, that's a great point to end. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Thanks to Andrew, Camille, Fritz, Giedrius, and Alison, and of course, Albert and David Systems. Have a great rest of your morning. Thank you.